Next on Words and Numbers, AI. Again.
Voting in Alaska.
Switzerland, of all places.
And happy Juneteenth.
Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
So, Ann, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
Well, I ran across this thing, and actually I thought for sure you would grab it as a foolishness. It's just too good.
We should ask the people to tell us which one is more foolish, the thing you found or the thing I found.
No, I should say it's not foolish, but it is amusing. How about that?
Fair enough.
This is coming out of Alaska. Actually, one of our listeners sent this to us. Representative, and this is not a state representative. This is to, I believe it's to the Senate, but nonetheless national. This representative named Dan Sullivan. He's running for re-election. A new contender has entered the race against him, also a Republican. So this is, I presume, a primary. The new contender's name, Dan Sullivan.
This has to be a first.
The first Dan Sullivan is threatening to sue the second Dan Sullivan on the basis of it confusing the voters. And the second Dan Sullivan takes out an ad, and you do the disclaimer at the beginning. So he says, I just have to read this. I'm Dan Sullivan, and I approve this message. And here's the message. Dan Sullivan says he's right for Alaska. But can we really trust Dan Sullivan? Hi, I'm Dan Sullivan. And I'm a name Alaska can trust, unlike Dan Sullivan. So on election day, don't vote for Dan Sullivan. Listen to Dan Sullivan. Avoid Dan Sullivan and vote for Dan Sullivan.
That's hilarious. Now, all right, I got to ask the obvious question. Was Dan Sullivan II born with the name Dan Sullivan, or did he change it to be a pain in the ass?
That's a good question. I do not know the answer to that.
Because I might have changed my name.
Just to mess with the guy.
Just to be a problem. My representative here is Juan Ciscomani. I don't think I could pass as Juan Ciscomani.
Well, and the thing is, this is a primary. They're both Republicans. So you can't say, well, the Republican Dan Sullivan, the Democratic.
Yeah, I guess you're going to have to drill down a little bit and hope they have a different middle name.
Right. This is just beautiful. Yeah. So
anyway,
we do know for certain who's going to win.
I want to take us to the courtroom, of all places. This is a federal case in Mississippi where both sides, the prosecutor and the defense, were found to be using AI to generate their pleadings, which were both filled with hallucinations.
Yeah.
Everybody on both sides, and this is the second time that we've covered this on this podcast. So how many times has it happened?
Right.
Both sides, in something as important as a federal court case, are full of shit, not doing their jobs. Shame on all of them. A pox on all of them.
Well, but at this point, James, it's just stupidity. Everybody knows that AI hallucinates if you're not careful.
Everybody does know. And, you would think if you're smart enough to pass the bar, you're smart enough to read a newspaper. But maybe not. This, Ant, brings us to the foolishness of the week. And for the first time, I think in my entire life, I'm going to pick on the Swiss. And you might say, what on earth have the Swiss ever done to anger anybody, right? The Swiss, famously neutral in everything. Just leave us be, we're Switzerland. They're having a bit of a problem in Switzerland right now. Well, it's not exactly a problem because they have a very highly diversified economy. Salaries are high. Income inequality comparatively low. You would think that they'd be really, really happy. But they're afraid of losing these things. So the Swiss are doing so well that now there's a pervasive fear in Switzerland that they're going to fall apart and have all kinds of problems. Enter the far-right Swiss People's Party with a solution to this problem. Any idea what their solution is?
I'm not quite sure they have a
given you a
problem,
hint
so
by-
I have no idea what the solution would be.
I've given you a hint by saying far right. They are going to cap the population of Switzerland.
Oh, for God's sake, when the entire developed world is struggling with slow population growth, they want to cap the population.
They are going to fix it so they never grow.
I'm astounded at the idiocy.
They've decided that 10 million is the right number. You can have 10 million Swiss and no more. What could possibly go wrong? Now, this is so stupid that I can't imagine a country, and look, the Swiss are an intelligent, advanced people, right? This is top 10 nations in the world kind of place, right? If you were forced to leave the United States and you didn't have Switzerland on your list as at least a possibility, you got a bad list. This is a good place. And I got to think that the Swiss are going to look at this and say, oh, good God, stop embarrassing us. Can't you see that everybody's watching? But if this passes, oh God, I can't wait to watch the fallout over time if this passes.
And people don't appreciate this. America is the United States has been for a long time the hotbed of industrialization, entrepreneurship, in large part because we're a free society, but also in large part because we have whatever it is, 320 million people. It's rare to find an entrepreneur. It's rarer still for them to be in the right place at the right time. So if you want a lot of them, you need a lot of people.
And to put it in perspective, Switzerland now has 9.1 million people.
Mm-hmm.
So they're looking at 9% more growth, and that's it.
Well, that's interesting. I wonder what Switzerland's population growth rate is.
It has grown rapidly. In the last 25 years, for example, it jumped from 7.2 to 9.1 million.
Well, this says it's currently just under 1%. So at 9.1 million, that means you're adding 91,000 a year. It's going to take them a long time to add the extra 10 million.
Unless they get back to previous rates.
Sorry, not 10 million, 1 million.
Years.
Yeah,
in the last 25 years, the rates have been higher than that.
Yeah. So by my numbers, it's going to take them, if their population growth rate doesn't shrink further, it's going to take them a decade to hit that cap. And by that time, these idiots will be gone.
Long gone, hopefully. And, I guess you're not going to be able to immigrate to Switzerland. Be out.
Hang on. There's a practical question here. I get the immigration thing. But how do you stop the Swiss from having more kids when you finally do reach that cap?
That's the interesting part, right? And they seem to realize that they can't do that. They would I'll read to you from the article. Should this referendum pass and should the population then exceed 10 million, Bern would be required to terminate its agreement with the EU on the free movement of people. The agreements linking Switzerland to the EU's single market would become null and void, opening the way to the political party in question's long-held dream, reimagining Switzerland as a deregulated buccaneering hub, trading freely with the world, a sort of alpine Dubai. I think we're mixing up a bunch of different ideas there in a way that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Do you get any feel for how much traction these people get?
Yeah, I suspect almost none. Yeah. That's why it's the foolishness of the week and not the tremendous fear of the week.
But, you started off by saying the Swiss are, they're afraid of losing their standard of living or what have you. That fear is something that I see more and more amongst Americans. The fear of, backsliding, of course, that's a fear. But I think part of that fear, and I'll admit it's only part, but I think it's a big part, is the fact that we have not lived through hardship in a very long time. By long time, I mean generations. And of course, people lose jobs and sickness and death and all of that. I'm talking hardship like a world war, rationing, the Depression.
Great Depression hardship, right. Yeah, no, and I remember when young people started comparing COVID to the Great Depression.
Oh, my Lord.
I would look up and say, oh, hold the phone.
Yeah.
Just stop it. People waited in line hoping to get soup that day.
Yep.
You're forced to stay in your house with your internet and your cable TV, you poor thing.
And get checks from the government.
Yeah. So you're right. We haven't experienced that kind of thing for a very long time, and most of the Western world hasn't. Not since World War II.
And I think when you don't experience that, I mean, on the one hand, I'm very thankful we haven't, but on the other hand, you don't learn how to deal with adversity, and adversity becomes this huge threat that it wouldn't otherwise be if you'd lived through something like that.
And as usual, my advice is always the same. Suck it up and knock it off. So this week on Words and Numbers, oddly, we have a friend of mine. So in other news, I have some friends. This time, it's my old graduate school friend, Thomas Krannawitter. Dr. Thomas Krannawitter, if you must. He is presently the president of WaypointsTeaching.com. I encourage you to go look that up, and I encourage you to listen to what he's got to say today. He's an expert on the Civil War era in the United States, and we've invited him on today to talk about Juneteenth, which is a holiday you might not know about, you might know about and be hostile about, but you should know about and appreciate. Tom, take it away. Juneteenth. Well, I mean, this was a holiday that found its place in the American pantheon of holidays in the Biden administration, which makes conservatives a little queasy when they think about it.
Yeah.
But to my mind, it's one of the greatest American holidays, or should be recognized as such. So why don't you tell us all about it?
I want to come back. There's some other stuff I want to talk about first, but I want to come back to the political aspect of this, because it's really ironic that Democrats have been taking ownership of this holiday when it's very much a Republican holiday. It wouldn't have happened without the early Republican Party. But let's start with the really weird name, right? Juneteenth. What does that mean? It's there's an old linguistic term. It's a portmanteau, which is a combination of words or phrases, to make one new word. It's a combination of June and 19th. And what it signifies is this amazing moment in June of 1865. So the Civil War is over. Abraham Lincoln has been dead for more than 2 months. And yet in the far reaches of the Union, places like Texas, and remember in 1865, I mean, Texas that's the far western frontier out there. Slave owners had not bothered to tell their slaves that they were free, that they weren't slaves anymore. And a Union general named Gordon Granger marches a couple thousand Union troops all the way through Texas, down to a tiny little island right off the coast called Galveston. And in Galveston, Texas, he announces in front of thousands of slaves that they are free, curiously, by virtue of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, think of how odd the timing of this is, right? Lincoln issued his final Emancipation Proclamation on New Year's Day, 1863. This is 2.5 years later. The Civil War has already concluded, and he's standing down there, and this U.S. Union Army general letting slaves know that they are now free men and women. And in fact, they were free men and women. The very first Juneteenth celebration happened the very next year on June 19th. So that'd be 1866. And it was just a group of local people, mostly Black people, newly freed Black people in Galveston. They decided to mark the moment, to mark the anniversary, and they got dressed up. They cooked food. They celebrated with music. This was a grand recognition of, in a way, you could say, the unofficial end of slavery. You know, word of freedom had reached the farthest stretches of the United States, of the Union. And to put this in a little bit of context, historical context, when you think of 1865, there's three key moments there. There's April, June, and December of 1865. So in April, Lee famously surrenders to Grant at Appomattox. And just a few days later, Lincoln is assassinated. He's shot the evening of April 14th, and he dies early the next morning. That effectively brings the war to a close, though not officially. And certainly none of those events mean that slavery's over. Slave owners are continuing to threaten and demand labor from their slaves in many places across the Union. A couple months later in June is when Granger marches down into Texas and announces to slaves that they're all free, backed up by, the power of the Union Army. And then fast forward 6 months later, the first week of December in 1865, that's when enough states ratify the 13th Amendment, and the Constitution formally abolishes slavery throughout the Union. I tend to take a kind of unusual view of when I talk about the American founding. I think many scholars and historians and others, they think of that little period around the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, 1776 to 1787 roughly. But when I think of the American founding, for me, it stretches from the Declaration of Independence all the way through to the 13th Amendment, because to found a regime upon that idea, that principle in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, that really did require the abolition of slavery. These things are incompatible with each other.
Yeah.
And we don't accomplish that part until the 13th Amendment, which really brings it raises the Constitution up into moral alignment with the Declaration of Independence.
And it's kind of funny, right this second in American historical circles, you've got a new kind of right-wing scholar that's claiming America is not a creedal nation, which invalidates the entire exercise. America is a creedal nation. There's no doubt about it. And if you're making that argument, you have ulterior political motives.
Yeah. What do you mean by creedal? What do you mean by creedal, James?
All men are created equal. The American creed.
Yeah.
Simply that. So, Tom, I have come to, I don't think when we were together in graduate school, I even had this thought. You probably didn't either. But I've come to equate Juneteenth with the 4th of July. Right?
Yeah.
In my mind, they occupy very much the same space, right? These are days about human freedom, human emancipation, and human self-government.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can purposefully celebrate one without the other.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I was just reading a little bit of recent scholarly literature on Juneteenth, and it's really curious how especially academic types and intellectuals, but I suppose others as well, political activists and just general critics out there, they're so quick to denounce the United States, to denounce the founding, to denounce this whole history of slavery. And there's always an unspoken premise there. The unspoken premise, what all these critics who are bad-mouthing America, the unspoken premise is all men are created equal. They don't say that, but if you scratch them with a few questions, you ask them, say, oh, so you think slavery's wrong, right? They'll say, oh, of course, it's terrible. Well, why? Why is it wrong for one human being to claim property ownership of another? And the answer is because human beings aren't property. They're human beings. Each of us has a natural rightful claim to govern ourselves, which is why slavery's wrong. So what's fascinating about the United States is not that there was slavery here at the time of the founding. The truth is slavery existed all over the globe. Slavery's been on every continent save Antarctica because, well...
Yeah, Tom, I don't know the answer to this. Maybe you do. Is there any country in the world that ever existed? So I'm including countries that are long gone.
Yeah.
That wasn't tinged by slavery in some way.
I don't know the answer either, but it would be shocking.
Because my guess is no.
Yeah, it'd be shocking. I mean, the truth is, so we have for the non-scholars out there, human time is usually divided between history and prehistory or prehistorical times. History is that period of time for which we have written records. It stretches back roughly 6,000 years. And certainly throughout all of recorded history, there are records of slavery. And they vary.
Well, Tom,
place.
Let me stop you right there.
Yeah.
The oldest legal code that we have in the world specifies how masters are to treat their slaves.
Right. And there's strong evidence. You go back into the prehistorical record. This is where, people are looking at scratches on caves and pots and things like that and trying to piece together how these ancient peoples lived. And there's strong evidence of slavery going back tens of thousands of years. It's been suggested, and I find this persuasive, that slavery likely emerged around the time when the earliest human beings started to domesticate animals. Because it's kind of a short step in logic from thinking, hey, if I can get a mule or, an ox or something like that to do work for me, why not just get the people from the neighboring clan or tribe to do that work? And it sort of makes sense. The point is, it's been around for a really long time. It's an ugly, old practice and tradition. And what makes the United States so remarkable is not that slavery was here. It's that in a world of slavery, these people stood up and said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And that principle is what makes slavery a terrible injustice. When you judge slavery according to that principle, it's intolerable. It's incompatible with that idea of equality. And that launched the way I describe the American founding is the greatest anti-slavery movement ever unleashed in human history. Certainly there are individual thinkers here and there who condemn slavery, but think of even the greatest civilizations, the Greeks and everything that they accomplished, or the Romans. Yes, they built, aqueducts and they invented philosophy and all this. It's fantastic. But one thing those great civilizations did not do, they did not organize coalitions and political movements to abolish slavery. The Americans did that, and they did it at a horrific price. They did it when it would have been much easier to just leave that subject alone. Just go about our lives and let it continue. And they refuse.
So a couple of things. One is detractors will point to 1776 and talk about the hypocrisy that they're talking about freedom and yet we have slavery. In listening to you, it's hitting home for me. Okay, there was a roughly 90-year stretch between 1776 and Juneteenth, and you could say, well, what the hell was wrong with people? It took them 90 years. to abolish slavery, except that that's 90 years following more than 6,000 years of it being normalized. So what's astounding to me listening to you is that it happened in such a short period of time. So here's the other thing
Anthony, let me put a little edge on your point, because you speak of it as if purchasing and trafficking human beings is over. It's not over today. You
Right.
can go into certain parts of Sudan and other parts of Africa, and if you have enough cash in your wallet, right now, today, you can purchase a human being. And you don't necessarily have to do it in some shadowy, back alley sort of deal. So slavery has existed throughout human time. It continues to exist today. Many groups of people chose to do nothing about slavery for centuries, and in some cases, millennia. And here come these Americans along, and, well, to use Lincoln's dating at Gettysburg, in 77 years, or just slightly more than that, they get rid of slavery by way of a terrible civil war that they didn't have to conduct or fight, and a constitutional amendment. It's remarkable how expeditious they were in getting rid of slavery.
So let me go back to the detractors for a moment, who will point to 1776 and say, well, okay, the founders said all men are created equal, but they did not mean blacks.
Yeah.
That somehow they're projecting in the founders' minds the founders did not consider blacks humans. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. There's a lot to say about that. This is years ago. I was talking in front of a class of young students in a very urban setting, and there was a young woman in the class, and let's just say her skin was less pasty than mine, and I was giving a talk about the founders and slavery. She was standing with her arms folded and shaking her head. So I just paused. I said, look, clearly something's on your mind. You have something to say. Go ahead and tell me. And she said, yeah, I don't want to hear any more about those founders. F them. They were a bunch of racist slave owners. They were terrible. I said, so let's be clear here. Do you think slavery was a moral wrong? And she said, you darn right, it's wrong. And I said, well, the founders agreed with you that it's wrong. And they said it's wrong because all men are created equal, because all human beings have an equal natural right to their own life, their own liberty, their own pursuit of happiness. Do you agree with them? And you could see she got angry. She wouldn't talk. You could see the gears right in her brain just started to clash, because she did not want to concede that they were right, that the principle is right and true. I mean, this might be a bad analogy, but it really boils down to something as simple as the murderer, the person who has committed murder, telling others murder is wrong and you shouldn't murder. I mean, he's right. Murder is wrong. You shouldn't murder. Just because he committed an act of murder doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean other people should go and do that. When James was introducing me, he mentioned this platform I'm launching, waypointsteaching.com, and I'm creating a lot of teacher content to help teach primary source documents, mainly from American history. And right now I'm creating all this content in the middle part of the 19th century. And it's really interesting to study the intra-Democratic Party disputes about the founding. So in one camp, you have prominent Democrats. This is the middle part of the 19th century. People like Stephen Douglas and Roger Taney, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He wrote that terrible opinion in the Dred Scott case. Their take was basically what you just said, Anthony. They said, well, when the founders said all men are created equal, they did not mean to include black people. They thought black people were just property and not really human. But along comes John C. Calhoun, one of the most influential of all defenders of slavery. So this guy is making an argument that slavery is a moral good, that it should be celebrated, that black people are inferior. And when he gets to the Declaration of Independence, this is fascinating. Calhoun says, yeah, Jefferson actually thought all men means all human beings, including black human beings. And Calhoun concludes, and that's why Jefferson was stupid. He was wrong. He thought black people could govern themselves and had equal natural rights, and Jefferson was absolutely wrong.
I mean, this is an interesting phenomenon in American history, Tom, because in the present day, people just automatically assume that the founding generation thought that black people were somehow less human or not human, what have you. And that point of view did not come to rule the day until the dawn of the Civil War, the decade or so before. And I have a favorite portion of the Declaration of Independence, and I'm sure you do too. And it's the part that didn't make it through the editing.
Yeah.
And I want to read it right now. It's short enough to read here. And this is Jefferson in the long list of indictments against King George III, a list that goes from least important to most important.
Yep.
And this was the final indictment against King George III.
It was also what you're about to read, if you're going to read what I think you are, it was also the longest charge against the king.
168 words off the top of my head, if I'm right about this. But speaking of King George, Jefferson writes, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself. I'm going to emphasize certain words as I go. Violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold.
Yeah. I love that Jefferson.
That's not all of it.
I love that Jefferson calls the King of England a pirate.
A pirate. Yeah, that's right.
And I love in that passage, it's Jefferson's own handwriting. He capitalizes all three letters, M-E-N. These slaves, these people being bought and sold as if they're property, they're really men. And you go back and compare that to that famous second sentence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And then we ask the question, did they understand that these are human beings? And the answer is absolutely. The other really telling piece of evidence is one of the most reviled passages of the Constitution, the 3/5 clause.
3/5 clause, that's right.
So when they were debating, they're in the Constitutional Convention, and there's a big fight about states with large populations and states with small populations, and the states with bigger populations, New York, Virginia, they want more representation. They want the bigger shareholders, so to speak, of the Congress. And smaller states like your home state of Connecticut and others, they're pushing back saying, wait, we're equally states. We want equal votes in our legislative branch. So the great compromise was to divide it into two chambers, have a Senate where every state is equally represented with 2 senators, and a House in which representation would be proportional. And this is when delegates from Georgia, from South Carolina, they stand up and they say, hey, we like this arrangement. This sounds really good. And we just want to clarify about that House of Representatives. Now, our understanding is the number of representatives we get is based on our population, right? Everyone says, yes, that's right. And they say, and we get to count our slaves, correct? And the very first reason they offer, they say, we want to count our slaves because they're people too. They're people. They're people living here in South Carolina and Georgia. Of course they're part of our population. And I mean,
but hold the phone.
Yeah.
That means that slave owners wanted slaves to count as 5/5.
That's right. That's right. And it was the people in the convention who most detested slavery and thought it was this immoral betrayal of our own principles. They said, look, you in Georgia and South Carolina, your laws don't treat them as citizens. So you treat them as property. You don't get to count that. You can count each slave as zero. Hamilton, during the convention, he says, look, if you want to count your slaves, that's okay. Free them first. Let them vote. Offer them citizenship. And then there will be no dispute about whether to count them. But what I point out to students, I say, isn't it interesting that this fight almost came to blows. I mean, this became very heated. It nearly broke the Constitutional Convention over whether to count slaves or not. And yet there was no dispute about whether to count mules or whether to count horses or whether to count oxen, because everyone in the room knew, well, mules aren't people. Horses aren't people. Everyone in the room knew these black slaves are human beings. And the problem is certain states pass laws that treat them as if they're property. So what do you do with that? What do you do when a state has those kinds of laws?
The modern problem is that young people, and I've actually in a debate with a college professor was told that the founders believed blacks were 3/5 human.
Yeah.
Right. And that is a total misread of the situation.
Yes.
Slave owners wanted them to count as 5/5.
Yep.
Abolitionists wanted them to count as 0/5.
Yep.
That means that the abolitionists thought that they were 0% human, which is it's just asinine on its face.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the abolitionists recognize their humanity, and we're saying you don't get to count them if you're going to treat them like property. Treat them like human beings. Offer them citizenship, or at least the freedom to leave, and then count them if you want to count them. But we just skip right past that in this urgent, desperate quest to somehow discredit the Constitution and the founding in general. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to go back to James' reading of that beautiful indictment that Jefferson wrote against the king. And it's absolutely correct that a person puts forth an argument, and the question is whether the argument is valid or not. What the person does is another matter. I get that. However, I am sympathetic with people who will push back at Jefferson's hypocrisy. And it leaves me wondering, how is it possible that someone can pen those words that James just wrote and not free his slaves? It does not call into question the veracity of what he wrote. Rather, it causes me to question what were his motives in writing it, because clearly he doesn't believe it.
He absolutely believed it. So a couple things that are important about Jefferson to know. I mean, this is a question of priorities. And Jefferson, as brilliant as he was in many aspects of life, personal finances was not one of them. He desperately needed the help of some financial advisors because he was broke and in debt his whole life. He dies in debt. He owes all kinds of people money. And yet he manages to import huge amounts of books. Remember, this is at a time when books were rare. Most houses had either no books at all, maybe a copy of the King James Bible, maybe a book of Shakespeare, but that was it. Jefferson had hundreds of them. It's why after the War of 1812, remember when the British returned and they burned down the Library of Congress, where did Congress turn to rebuild the Library of Congress? They bought Jefferson's personal collection. This is how many books he had. He also loved imported French wine and champagne and all that sort of stuff. And the question is, could he have spent less money on booze and books and more money manumitting his slaves? Remember, at that time, every state, including Virginia, had laws regarding manumission. If a slave owner was going to free a slave, you had to provides, there were certain provisions required so that the idea was that a freed slave could go out and be, productive and interact with the rest of society, not just be homeless and hungry. And so it costs a lot of money, anywhere from $250 to $500 per slave to manumit the slave. And Jefferson prioritized booze and books over that. I also think for Jefferson thought about slavery in the context of all the other achievements his generation accomplished. I mean, they defeated the greatest military on the face of the planet, the British Army and Navy. Then they created the most unique self-governing constitutional republic that the world had ever seen, for which there was no model. They created a constitution that has no titles of nobility, right? I mean, they come from a world of kings and queens and princes and our Constitution abolishes all that. It enshrines property rights. They create the first regime of religious liberty at a moment when Europe is blowing themselves apart because of religious differences. And then Jefferson looked at this nut of slavery, this hard problem to crack. And I think Jefferson thought that's for the next generation. We've done our share of good things. This is for the next generation to figure out.
Tom, I'm even happy to say he was a hypocrite.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that's a perfectly justified conclusion to reach.
Yes.
But the thing that matters are the words that he wrote. That's what carried us along, right? That the statement that all men are created equal leads inexorably to Juneteenth.
Yeah.
There is no other option. Well, I mean, there is one other option, and that's the whole project collapses.
Yep. Well, I let me add to that, James. I agree. I actually think we should have a day celebrating hypocrisy, because the three of us likely can agree that if we could wave a magic wand and make Thomas Jefferson perfect, and go back in time and have him extolling beautiful, just principles of moral right and act according to that, that would be wonderful. He didn't. So if we demand consistency from him, I often ask people, would you prefer that he wrote on paper, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all black people are inferior to white people? Then he would have been consistent with his practices in his personal life. I'm happy he was a hypocrite. I'm happy he articulated the principles of justice and individual liberty, and then, he fell short in his personal life. That's a shame. I wish he wouldn't. I wish he had been a better man and had lived up to his own principles. But look, we all do. All of us fall short of the principles that we hold dear. That doesn't refute the principles.
I think you might be hard-pressed to find somebody in the founding generation that wouldn't have referred to George Washington as the best American.
Right.
And he did the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Right. This is a problem without question, but how we look at it now is up to us, not up to them.
To his credit, Washington. Now, this is another important historical facet of this. I've been studying the literature of the founding my adult life, as you guys have, and I have never seen one shred of evidence of anyone of the founding generation making a moral defense or a moral justification of slavery as a moral good. It was always articulated as an evil, sometimes a necessary evil, a regrettable evil or injustice, something that people have deeply entrenched interests in, and so they're just not going to let go of it, which was absolutely true. But all of them recognize the injustice, that it's a problem. And in the case of George Washington, in his last will and testament, he makes provisions for the emancipation of all of his slaves, and the older ones he offers. He says, look, if you want to be manumitted and freed, you are free to go. And if you prefer staying here, There will be accommodations for you at Mount Vernon for the rest of your life. It is your choice what you want to do. But I think what's most notable and what most people miss is the fact that slavery became this gigantic moral problem for Americans. For most clans, tribes, nations, cultures throughout history, most people did not view slavery as a problem to be solved. They looked at it as just a fact of life and
Just
a
another
traditional thing and something that's going to continue. And these Americans were not satisfied with that. They insisted on denouncing it as problematic and wrong and figuring out a way to get rid of it. And they did.
It's interesting you say that, because I was a few months ago in Nashville and went to the Nashville Museum there. Of course, as you can imagine, there's sections devoted to the Civil War and slavery and so forth. And as you would imagine in so many museums, it's presented, and rightly so, as the evils of slavery. And I'm looking at the stuff they have there, and I notice there are Black people walking around. They're visitors there. A class comes through of younger kids. The teacher is Black. And I'm looking around thinking the vestiges of this thing, this horrible thing, are largely gone. I mean, there's, people could talk about civil rights and that sort of thing. I don't mean to minimize that, but compared to what was,
Right.
it's gone. And it occurs to me, we spend so much time, and I think it's right, focusing on the evils of slavery in the United States, but we don't spend nearly enough time talking about how wonderful it was that we were amongst the first countries to put an end to this thing.
And what's ironic is, especially in our age today, 2026, we're a more caring nation. We're more supportive. We're more therapeutic than ever before. And imagine the coach of a team or a parent with his own children. If you were just constantly complaining about everything the people around you did wrong, right? That's not the way you get better in performance. You praise and celebrate, right? I mean, what happens when your kid's potty training and the very first time they actually make it right to the potty, you're having a little party, you're celebrating, right? You're doing, way to go, way to go. You really encourage them for that one good thing that they did so that they'll do the good thing again. And yet when it comes to American history, we seem fixated on the shortcomings, the moral failings, rather than on the unprecedented good that was accomplished. And here, maybe this is the place to sort of turn this back into a slightly political direction, because I have found this fascinating. There is a large segment of our population today who seems to be very deeply interested in American history from a very critical point of view. They want to use history to denounce the founding, to denounce the Constitution, to denounce all kinds of American traditions and institutions. But that same group of people doesn't seem to be interested in the history of the oldest political party, which is about to turn 200 years old in 2 years. And the oldest political party, which is the Democratic Party, that is the history of that party is the history of all the ugliness that happens. James mentioned a little bit ago that the pivot from viewing slavery as this awful, terrible thing, and we need to solve it, and no one knows quite exactly sure how to do that right now, but it needs to go away. That pivot to viewing that as a good thing, that slavery is something wonderful, and we just celebrate it and spread it all over. That pivot happens because of the Democratic Party. They institutionalize this view that slavery is right and good, and that is the same party that then launches the Ku Klux Klan afterwards. It's the party that launches Jim Crow after that. It's the party that to this day won't let go of racial tribalism and preferences and all of this. And yet Juneteenth has become owned by Democrats. I wrote a little piece, actually, Jim, as an editor, published this a couple years ago, and I sort of recounted in the last generation, multiple states started adopting Juneteenth as a state holiday, and in almost every case, it was Democratic governors. North and South, East and West, all over the country. And then recently, I mean, when was that? 2021 or 22, that Democrat Joe Biden, as president, right, declares Juneteenth a national holiday. And so it's fascinating to me that the Republican Party was formed in 1854 for one purpose: to stop the spread of slavery out to the Western territories. That was it. And they recognized then, look, slavery exists in some of the old states like South Carolina, like Georgia, where it has been since the time of the founding. And a national party or the federal government has no power there. But certainly the federal government has power to legislate in a territory that's owned by the United States in common, and they wanted to stop it. And there was only one national organization opposing that Republican agenda, and that was the Democratic Party. They were the party of slavery. And that's not a partisan smear. That's actual American history. And so it is striking to me that Democrats today want to claim ownership of Juneteenth and celebrate it at the very moment that large numbers of Republicans flee from it. They want nothing to do with it. They feel uncomfortable talking about it. And I'm thinking, to Republicans, if anything, you should be the ones celebrating this. You should be making this a grand holiday. It's part of your party's history.
I'm going to go a step or two further than you, Tom. I don't want it to be a partisan issue. I want it to be an American issue. I want every American to wake up and celebrate that day.
Yeah.
To just sit back, if only to think about the blood that was shed, the lives that were lost to slavery, right? The treatment that human beings received at the hands of other humans. And yet, I'm going to tell my favorite story in the world to end this episode, but we're not quite there yet, because there's two other things that I think are really, really important to get to first. About the quote-unquote naturalness of slavery. I mean, you make the point that it's as far back as human history goes, we see slavery.
Yeah.
Well, I am a student of political philosophy, and I can tell you that Aristotle himself thought that slavery was a natural institution, that there was no problem with it whatsoever. He said there are slaves by nature. Imagine such a thing. And that's in a world in which you could be a prince one day and a slave the next if a battle didn't go your way. So we're really dealing with an entrenched thing that every smart human being had thought of, and no one had said, we have to stop this.
James, I'm gonna push back just a little bit. I'm gonna suggest to you that a little closer reading of Aristotle might suggest a different view. Aristotle distinguishes natural slaves from slaves by convention or law.
By convention, sure.
And he's very clear that slaves by convention or law, that's an unjust form of governance. That should not exist. But he defines what he calls natural slaves very carefully. A natural slave is what Aristotle describes as someone incapable of governing himself, lacking the mental or intellectual faculties. I think it's the kind of people today we rightly put in institutions for their own well-being, because they cannot care for themselves.
But that's exactly the argument you get in the 1850s about blacks in America.
It is.
Exactly.
Yes.
Now, but the thing that I really want to get to is what happened when slaves were freed. Because I can tell you with 100% certainty, if I had been enslaved and then freed, I would be going on a vengeance tour as soon as humanly possible.
Yeah.
And that didn't generally happen. And the capacity that human beings have to forgive extraordinarily horrible things is quite astonishing. And if this is too much, if this is too far back in the past to think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, where you could walk in as a white man who had done horrible things, admit the things you had done, and be forgiven and sent home. The capacity of human beings to forgive atrocious behavior is astonishing.
Yeah.
And I think that's the real spirit of Juneteenth. It's freedom, yes, but it's this spirit of a group of people who never had anything, who all of a sudden became free and decided, in fact, to be free.
Yep.
And that's a bold and courageous thing.
I'll add a chapter of that history. A group of growing numbers of newly freed, mostly Southern, black slaves, started hearing rumors that there was a dusty little town in Oklahoma, up near Tulsa, Oklahoma, and you could go there as a black man, a black woman, and you could live freely. And so growing numbers of blacks start heading there. This is basically a generation after the Civil War. So they start heading there in the 1880s and the 1890s. By the early 1900s, there are thousands of free black men and women and families, and they create their own police departments, and they create their own fire departments. They create their own banks. They don't worry about if some bigoted cafe owner won't let them sit at their lunch counter. You know what they do? They open their own lunch counter. And they build one of the most gorgeous 5-star hotels in the United States at that time. They open clothing stores and department stores, and they're building houses, right? The point is simply this: they're doing what free people tend to do, who want to improve their lives. When they're secure in their liberty and their property, they're productive and they're inventive and they are trading with each other. And yeah, just down the road are some racists who don't want to trade with them, and we don't care. We don't need some federal program to make them come interact. We just want to be safe in our own home, in our own business, our own property. That's all we ask for. And it becomes so prosperous that it becomes nicknamed Black Wall Street, because there's such an enormous amount of wealth concentrated in this little neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Think of what Tulsa must have been in the early 1900s. It's kind of a dusty, miserable town now. It had to really be dusty and miserable then. And these people consumed with hatred and bigotry, they go and they burn it down, and they slaughter hundreds of them. And this is the end of Black Wall Street. But what the fascinating piece, there's a political lesson, there's a moral lesson, there's an economic lesson right there. This is a generation of people who had actually been slaves, not, 10 generations, but no, they had been slaves. Now they're free. And once they have some security in their property rights, they create new businesses, and they build stores and banks and restaurants and all these amazing things. They ask for nothing for free. They ask for no handouts whatsoever. And they don't use their energy to go seek revenge. Rather, they do things like fall in love and get married and raise their children. That's what they're doing. And trying to run a business and just, dealing with the ordinary challenges of life. That's a real model of freedom that we have right within our own history. And it's an amazing story.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell the story that Ant's heard 1,000 times, but I don't think I've ever told you, Tom. And we probably have scores of new listeners, tens of new listeners who have never who have never heard it before, but I was at Monticello one day, and I was standing at Jefferson's grave, and there is a place at the grave where you can look to your left and see Monticello, and you can look off to your right a little bit and see the old slave quarters. And you can really kind of sense the tension in the man at that one place.
Yeah.
Right? Because on his grave, author of the Declaration of Independence, right? It shows up first.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, he's got 3 things on his grave. His 3 greatest accomplishments. Being president didn't make the list.
Yeah.
This is how successful he was. So I'm standing there, just kind of taking it all in, paying my respects the way you do. And these 2 little kids came tearing ass by me, yelling and screaming like 2 little boys do. They must have been like 3 and 5. And they're just running towards Monticello. And then their parents came up behind them, and it was a black woman and a white man. This was the most American moment I have ever had in my entire life. I'm standing in front of Jefferson's grave, and 2 mixed-race kids ran by me to go see Jefferson's house, and a mixed-race couple walked by me, didn't even look at me, like it was no big deal at all, because it wasn't. And that's how you kind of know that no matter how many people whine and moan about our history, the vast majority of people they follow your description of the people in Tulsa.
Mm-hmm.
They just want to get on with their lives. They want to be secure. The ultimate property right is in oneself, right? They want to be secure in their bodies. They want to be left alone. They don't want harm to come to them. And then they want to have human relationships with whoever the hell they choose.
Yep.
For whatever reason they want.
I'd like to tie this. This is a wonderful theme, maybe to wind things down. And I want to tie it back to Lincoln, because without Lincoln, without the Declaration, there wouldn't have been a Lincoln. And without Lincoln, there would not have been an Emancipation Proclamation or a 13th Amendment, and there certainly would not have been a Juneteenth. In his famous debates in the late months of 1858 with Stephen Douglas, Douglas and his fellow Democrats, they got really ugly, really nasty. The way they would denounce Lincoln and others, they would say these are black Republicans. These are black Republicans who just want to jump into bed and sleep with Negroes. But they didn't use the word Negroes. And they put this stuff on banners. They would hang them up at these debates, that they're Negro lovers, but the other word. And Stephen Douglas even jokes and says that we have to pass laws to prevent white people and black people from having children and sexual relations, because these black Republicans are so enamored with black women. So Lincoln gets up, and of course he has to address this, because if these accusations stick, you can't get elected in Illinois or anywhere else. And he says, I don't know of anybody. Judge Douglas accuses me of wanting perfect social equality in all ways, marriage and voting and every other way. And he said, I honestly don't know of anybody who demands that kind of perfect equality, except there's one case I've heard. This is at the opening of the 4th debate in Charleston, Illinois. And Lincoln says it's Judge Douglas's old friend, Colonel Richard M. Johnson. Now, I remember the very first time I was reading the debates, I couldn't remember who's Richard M. Johnson. So I go look.
This story is legitimately hilarious.
Oh, it's fantastic. So Richard M. Johnson, he is one of the greatest Democratic heroes. I mean, the heroes of the Democratic Party, second maybe only to Andrew Jackson himself. I mean, he was a a war hero in the War of 1812. He had served he had been in Congress for a long time. He was vice president under Martin Van Buren. I mean, this guy was at the center of, political life. And he famously had a slave woman with whom he lived and whom he presented in public settings as his wife. And they had children, and they raised them as a family would. Like, there was nothing hidden or concealed or shameful. That was his wife, and these were their daughters. And okay, so then I realized part of why Lincoln mentions that example, it's embarrassing for Douglas and the Democrats, because they're out there saying, oh, these Republicans want to sleep with black women. Well, who's one of the most famous people in America who's sleeping with a black woman? Colonel Richard M. Johnson, who's a lifelong Democrat. But then I went back and looked at it closer. Lincoln says, there's an example of someone who actually wants perfect equality. And I started reading Colonel Johnson's youngest daughter. Her name was Adeline. I get kind of teary telling this story. Adeline dies at a very young age. And so his friends are writing him letters of condolence. Your daughter died. We're sorry. And I've discovered some of the letters he wrote in response back. And what's clear in these letters, his wife is the love of his life. And he adores these children. There's kids, there's daughters, and it breaks his heart that she had died. And all of a sudden I realized when Lincoln said, there's an example of someone who wants real equality, I think at some level he was being perfectly literal. And his point was, look, most of you Americans today, you're not ready for that. In 1858, you're not ready to talk about how we could live and have families and marry who we would. You're not ready for any of that. But for those of you who want to know what perfect equality would look like, go look at Richard Johnson. Go look at the way he treats his wife and his mulatto children. They're not mulatto to him. They're just his two girls. That's what Juneteenth represents, is that freedom and that ability to live with people we actually love and care about, and we want to help, and we want them to take care of us, and do it freely and peacefully.
Amen. And as luck would have it, Tom, this episode rolls out on June 18th.
Excellent.
So people will think about it a little bit, and maybe June 19th can be a thing for some people.
I would ask those in your sizable and growing audience who care about freedom, who care about justice, to not be quick to dismiss Juneteenth. Rather, embrace it, celebrate it. It is an amazing story of the triumph of good over evil, of justice over injustice, of human liberty and flourishing.
It's a great American day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, Tommy, thanks for coming on. And for those of you out there who are interested in checking out what Tom does, go ahead and plug it one more time.
Yeah, Waypoints teaching.com. It's a platform of primary source documents. My real target here are high school teachers and homeschooling parents who want to incorporate more primary source documents. So it's not just the documents. There's a whole catalog of tutorials to help the teachers prepare for their own presentations of those famous historic documents. Waypointsteaching.com.
So, Tommy, it's been a number of years since I've seen you. I miss you every day. It's good to have you on, and hope I see you in the three-dimensional world. But, if I don't, I love you just the same.
I love you too, brother, and we're going to make it happen really soon.
We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you.